What was college football like 10 years ago? Well, there was a lot of crazy stuff going on, and the landscape looked completely different. At the time, I was in middle school, and I was just one of those people who watched Mizzou play every week. The Tigers are my team, and I didn't really pay attention to the rest of the sport. 2014, though, was the first season in which I fell in love with the game. I fell in love with all the different teams, I updated all the rosters in NCAA 14, and finally paid attention to everything going on in the college football world. It's insane that that was a decade ago, but in today's video, we're going to talk about what college football was like. This video is supposed to take a look back at week 1 from the 2014 season and all the crazy things that happened, but because of some crazy life circumstances I had, I was not able to upload much these last 2 weeks, so this video is a little bit late, but I still think you guys are really going to enjoy it. We're going to talk about some of the top games, top storylines, and top takeaways from what the heck was going on in college football in early September of 2014. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and go back in time 10 years. So the first thing I want to talk about is the top 10 most memorable games from week 1 of 2014. The first one was a Thursday night showdown between South Carolina and Texas A&M. Pretty much everybody remembers this one, as number 21 Texas A&M would burst onto the scene in their post-Johnny Manziel era. They'd end up beating South Carolina 52-28, and they would upset Steve Spurrier and the number 9 Gamecocks. The main reason for this was the arrival of their new quarterback, Kenny Hill. He ended up having an insane game, as he threw for 511 yards and 3 touchdowns, breaking Johnny Manziel's single-game passing record. A&M had 39 first downs in the game and 680 yards of total offense. He started going by Kenny Trill instead of Kenny Hill. Texas A&M was on top of the world, and many were going crazy about what Kevin Sumlin was building in College Station. Oh, how it has changed 10 years later. Another big game was Georgia versus Clemson. In the SEC, there was a star being born as number 12 Georgia beat number 16 Clemson 45-21. Most of that offensive output came from running back Todd Gurley, who ran for 200 yards and 3 touchdowns. The passing game was not working for either school, as Clemson opted to start Cole Stout at quarterback instead of Deshaun Watson, and Hudson Mason played for Georgia. Gurley was a legit Heisman contender after running for almost 1,000 yards the year before, and Mark Richt looked like he could finally have another Bulldog team that could compete for an SEC title. Another really fun game was Florida State versus Oklahoma State. Number 1 FSU defended its 2013 title against OSU, just barely beating them with a 37-31 win. It was one of the most interesting week 1 games that week, as it was a defensive battle between Florida State's secondary and Oklahoma State's electric offensive players. Jameis Winston struggled at quarterback a little bit, throwing for 2 interceptions, but still put up 370 yards and a touchdown through the air, as well as one of his career-defining runs on the ground. Oklahoma State's Tyreek Hill ran 6 kick returns back for 140 yards, but it still wasn't enough to keep the Pokes within shooting distance. It is that time of the year, as winning season is back, football is back, and MyBookie is here to make sure you are ready to cash in on all the action. This season, MyBookie is pulling out all the stops with incredible promotions like a weekly risk-free boost on Thursdays where you can bet without a sweat. If your bet hits, you win big. If it doesn't, forget it. MyBookie will refund your wager. But that's just the beginning. MyBookie is giving away hundreds of thousands in prizes with their Super, Survivor, and Square contests. Get your entries now in for your shot at huge cash rewards. When you're ready to get started, be sure to use my promo code FISHER50 and make sure to get some extra cash on top of your first deposit. Okay, but what do you get when you use my promo code? Well, if you type in Fisher50, you'll get up to $1,000 in a welcome bonus bet, plus a $10 casino chip. MyBookie's tiered bonuses make it easy to deposit with crypto or with credit, and the bigger your deposit, the bigger your bonus. The bonus would be 100% match up to $1,000 plus a $10 casino chip. As of now, loyalty plays off with MyBookie Plus. The more you play, the more you win. It's simple. Climb through the tiers of loyalty rewards programs to unlock even more epic promotions, exclusive giveaways, and bigger rewards. With MyBookie, you can bet on anything, anywhere, at any time, and make your season a winning season. Be sure to check out my link down below and use my promo code FISHER50. That is FISHER50. The next big game was Alabama versus West Virginia. The number 2 Crimson Tide barely held off WVU 33-23 in a crazy quarterback duel, this time between Clint Trickett and Blake Sims. Trickett would throw for 365 yards and a touchdown, and Sims threw for 250 yards and a pick, but the Tide still managed to win thanks to 126 yards and 2 touchdowns from TJ Yeldon and 100 more from Derrick Henry. But more impressive was the wide receivers they were throwing to. Kevin White for West Virginia had 143 yards and a touchdown, and Amari Cooper had 130 yards. The running game and time of possession was enough for the Crimson Tide to win, and what's funny And what's funny is that game was a showcase of the top 2 receivers drafted the following season in both Kevin White and Amari Cooper. Before Auburn fell into the place that they're at now, they were an extremely competitive football team in 2014 under Gus Malzahn. It showed with a 45-21 victory over Arkansas in Week 1, and this was even with their backup quarterback Jeremy Johnson playing most of the game, since Nick Marshall was serving a suspension to start the year. Johnson went for 243 yards and 2 touchdowns, throwing mostly to star receiver Duke Williams, who had 154 yards and a touchdown. At the time, Cam Artis-Payne was the running back, and he had 177 yards and a score on the ground then. Another fun game was UCLA versus Virginia, as the number 7 Bruins took a road trip to Virginia and barely survived 28-20. Brett Hundley was the starting quarterback for the Bruins, and while he did throw for almost 250 yards, he didn't find the end zone once through the air, only on a quarterback run. While the offense did look bad, UCLA would pick off Grayson Lambert twice, and they even took a fumble to the house to pull away from the Cavs. UCLA's defense scored 21 points, and it was enough to win the game on their own, but it was a hint towards problems to come in the future for the Bruins. We have 4 more huge games to talk about, and the first one is Wisconsin-LSU. Number 14 Wisconsin couldn't beat number 13 LSU in Houston 24-28, as they ended up losing that game by 4. LSU quarterback Anthony Jennings went 9 of 21, but still had 239 yards and 2 touchdowns, which was enough to outduel Tanner McAvoy's 8 of 24, 50-yard, 2-interception performance. The real battle was between Badger running back Melvin Gordon and Tiger running back Kenny Hilliard, who put up 140 yards and 110 yards respectively. Trayvon Durrell was the lone offensive output for LSU, catching 3 passes for 150 yards and a touchdown, which ended up being the difference in the game. Another fun one was Penn State versus UCF, as Penn State would survive UCF in Ireland 26-24, in one of the first games back in Ireland and the start of a new series overseas in college football. Christian Hackenberg wowed NFL scouts with his big arm, throwing for 450 yards and a touchdown, mostly to Geno Lewis, but he also had a couple of picks. Justin Holman couldn't get it done for the night and only managed 200 yards and a score, and neither team could get the ground game going. Hackenberg's day was enough to let their kicker win the game, and they ended up pulling it off in the last few seconds. North Dakota State was always a tough out in the mid-2000s, and they bludgeoned Iowa State 31-14 to start the 2014 season to solidify themselves as a giant killer in the FCS. Carson Wentz started his NFL campaign with a 200-yard passing performance, and Bison running back John Crockett put up 140 yards and 3 touchdowns on the ground to suffocate the Cyclones and quarterback Sam Richardson, who threw for 2 picks. While Iowa State wasn't expected to do much that season, North Dakota State proved to the country that they were always going to be a threat after beating K-State the previous year. The final game I want to talk about is Miami versus Louisville. This was a Monday night showdown, and this was post Teddy Bridgewater. They looked like they had found their next man up in Will Gardner, as the Cardinals had beat the Canes 31-13 in their first game in the ACC. Gardner threw for over 200 yards and 2 touchdowns, and this was better than Brad Kaya, who had thrown for 174 yards, a touchdown, and 2 picks. Dominic Brown had 143 yards and a touchdown on the ground for the Cards, and Duke Johnson finished with just 90. The game proved that Louisville would be just fine in the ACC moving forwards, and the Cardinals and Hurricanes were moving in opposite directions as programs. Now I want to talk about the 5 best performances from that week. Kenny Hill obviously had the best. He ended up throwing for 511 yards and 3 touchdowns against a South Carolina team that many thought was going to be pretty dang good. Johnny Manziel called him Kenny Football after the game, and honestly, he deserved it. Kenny wanted to be called Kenny Trill instead, which just kind of sounds funny, and despite how good Kenny looked in this game, he wouldn't play that well the rest of the season and would end up transferring to TCU after the season was over. Todd Gurley had ran for 1,000 yards in the previous 2 years, and as a junior, he was considered a threat for the best running back in the country and was getting ridiculous NFL hype. Week 1 proved that with his massive 200-yard, 3-touchdown rushing performance that immediately had dog fans thinking back to Herschel Walker. Despite it being his last season, his junior year would actually be his worst in terms of his production, as he'd only finished with 911 yards instead of over 1,000. Another big game was Marcus Mariota. He wasn't even in, but ended up winning 62-13, and he was a huge part of this. He threw for 267 yards with 3 touchdowns and a 70% completion percentage, and also added 43 yards and a touchdown on the ground before he was replaced by Jeff Locke to keep him healthy for the rest of the year. This was the start of his Heisman winning season, and a season that would propel him to being one of the most sought-after quarterback prospects in the NFL draft that season, alongside Jameis Winston. Melvin Gordon would run for 140 yards and a touchdown in that game against LSU, and averaged a first down every time he touched the ball. There were some running backs who maybe had bigger days, but to put up 140 yards on just 16 carries against LSU is pretty insane. He's one of 3 running backs to play and score for the Badgers and was clearly the most impressive. This game gave him a ton of NFL hype. The last guy was TJ Yeldon, as obviously it was an offensive shootout against West Virginia, but he put up 130 yards and 2 touchdowns, and this was extremely impressive for a guy who was sharing carries with Derrick Henry. Henry had run for 113 yards and a touchdown in that game and was overshadowed by Yeldon. There was a little bit there in 2014 where people wondered if TJ was actually the better back than Henry. It's funny how things have worked out in the long run. So what were the 5 main takeaways from the first weekend in 2014? Well, offense was taking over the SEC. The SEC was always well known for its defense, but with offensive shootouts taking place with teams like Texas A&M, Auburn, and Georgia, it slowly started to shift into the SEC being a conference of offense as well. Bo Wallace at Ole Miss threw for 387 yards and 4 touchdowns, and Russell Hansbrough at Mizzou ran for 126 yards. Patrick Towles at Kentucky had almost 400 passing yards, and Dak Prescott at Mississippi State had 284 yards and 4 total touchdowns. Stuff was getting crazy. Jameis Winston was still the Heisman frontrunner, despite some of the weird stats against Oklahoma State. He still commanded the attention of the country after a Heisman winning season the year before. A lot of this had to do with the crazy run he had against Oklahoma State in the third quarter, where he hurdled a Cowboy defender and instantly juked around another one to score a touchdown from 30 yards out, proving he wasn't just a threat with his arm, but also able to run on the ground. Another takeaway was that the Pac-12 was wide open. Back in 2014, the Pac-12 was still in the middle of dominating runs by Oregon, but it looked like there'd be a few challengers to the Ducks early on. One of those challengers was Arizona State, with offensive weapons like Jalen Strong and DJ Foster having a ton of big games. Anu Solomon in Arizona looked pretty good, and then Cody Kessler in USC also looked really good. Who was going to win the conference? That was a big question mark. The Big 12 was not really that good. Before Texas was back, Oklahoma was led by Trevor Knight and Samaje Perine, who looked like the cream of the crop in the conference alongside Baylor, led by Bryce Petty, and then TCU led by Trevon Boykin. Those were the only other 2 schools that looked like they could compete with the Sooners for a conference title. K-State, led by Jake Waters and Bill Snyder, were the only team that would end up coming close, and of course we know that OU would have a disappointing 8-5 season, and that TCU and Baylor would end up at number 5 and 6 in the country, and somehow found a way to get locked out of the playoff because of the Big 12's lack of a conference championship game. One last takeaway was that Michigan State looked scary. While the main storylines entering the season for the Big Ten had to do with the quarterback room at Ohio State, Connor Cook and the Spartans started off 2014 by routing Jacksonville State 45-7 and didn't struggle at all. A huge part of that was the emergence of wide receiver Tony Lippett, who had 167 yards and 2 touchdowns on the day for the Spartans. The only other Big Ten team that looked that impressive was Nebraska, who had a big win over FAU 55-7. That is what Week 1 looked like in 2014. A lot of those names are super nostalgic to me, and college football has changed so much since that moment. It was so much fun to watch, and let me know what you guys think of this video. What do you think about college football 10 years ago, and should I do this again for another week or another year? I'd be happy to do this series more often if it actually does well, so be sure to let me know down below, and leave a like if you want to support today's video. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.